There you go.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. Good evening to some of you, where everybody's coming in from several corners of the world tonight, or today, this morning, whichever part of the world you're in. I'm happy to have all of you here on behalf of Manila House. My name is Bambina Olivares, and I'm the Director of Programming. We've come up with this webinar largely as a result of the Black Lives Matter protest, which sort of shone a spotlight on a little known part of Philippine and American history, the Philippine-American War that began in 1899, and which saw a contingent of Black American soldiers called Buffalo Soldiers, who actually came to the Philippines to fight against the Philippine revolutionaries and saw the injustice, the racial injustice and the way they were treated by the American Army, and decided to defect and join the Philippine revolutionaries. This actually is a subject of a documentary film and currently in production by Mark Harris, a filmmaker who is our main speaker tonight. And we've put this talk together for you. So I hope you're ready for a little history lesson. It's a part of our history, both American and Filipino history, that we should know more about, especially in the current climate, political and cultural climate we're currently experiencing at the moment. Before we start, I'm going to show you a quick documentary, a trailer of the film. It's called Conflict of Conscience, Buffalo Soldiers in the Philippine-American War. And as I mentioned, Mark Harris is a producer, writer, director. His co-producers include Danny Glover and Sam, sorry. That's right. Okay, let me get on with it. And then I'll introduce you to Mark and the rest of the speakers after that. Thank you.
To introduce you to a documentary film intimately involved in. A Conflict of Conscience, Buffalo Soldiers in the Philippine-American War. What am I talking about? It's not World War II. It's a war that took place at the turn of the century at the end of the Spanish-American War. Now let's go back in our memory. The sinking of the battleship Maine, Teddy Roosevelt charging up San Juan Hill, in which Buffalo Soldiers also saw action. That war. At the conclusion of the Spanish-American War, Spain ceded Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the US. Now the Filipinos had already been fighting Spain for several years and were on the verge of gaining their independence until we arrived. Now they faced a more formidable foe, the Army of the United States of America. This is a war which has pretty much been written out of American history. Why? The war proceeded much as many wars do. The Filipinos won some battles and Americans won some. As American losses began to mount at an alarming rate due to malaria and other tropical diseases, someone in the War Department decided that Black soldiers were immune to these tropical diseases. So in 1899, approximately 7,000 Buffalo soldiers were to fight the Filipino revolutionaries, who were led by a very savvy and capable leader, Gill Boehringer. In our film, A Conflict of Conscience, Buffalo Soldiers in the Philippine-American War, you will hear about Gregorio del Pilar, nicknamed the Boy General, who at 19 years of age led 60 of his fellow soldiers, sacrificing their lives to delay the advancement of the U.S. Army's 33rd Infantry Regiment. You also meet John Calloway, a Buffalo soldier, dishonorably discharged because he wrote a letter indicating sympathy for the Filipino people. And there's David Fagan, another Buffalo soldier from Florida, who was so appalled by American atrocities that he joined the Filipino resistance and rose to the rank of captain. Buffalo soldiers generally felt it was their duty to fight as Americans, an enemy of their country. They believed by showing that they were good soldiers, it would result in better treatment at home once they returned. A conflict of conscience, Buffalo soldiers in the Philippine-American War, chronicles a very turbulent time in American history, a time when brutal racism existed at home, a time when America was expanding its territories abroad. It also tells a story of very unique individuals who helped to personalize a very complicated story, but a story which is worth telling. Thank you.
Okay, thanks again, everyone. Now, speaking with us today, we couldn't get Danny Glover, although I know Mark, you had asked him, or we had tried to ask him, but we're happy to have all of you with us today. And I'll start by introducing Mark Harris, who put this talk together with me. And he's a director and producer of the documentary alongside Danny Glover and Sam Pollard. Mark has had an extensive career in television, winning an Emmy and 2 Cine Golden Eagle directing awards. He's directed several television series episodes, including 30 Something and also Sesame Street, and for BET Biographies in Black and the Russell Simmons Story, and PBS's Imaging America. Next up will be Vince Rafael, who's spoken on a different webinar for us before. And he is a professor of history at the University of Washington in Seattle. And he's written extensively about Philippine and American history, particularly the history of colonialism in the Philippines. And then from Vince, we're going to move on to Anthony Powell, who is a public speaker and historian, and he has devoted more than 30 years to teaching, studying, collecting, and writing about the Buffalo Soldier. He's going to be followed by Frank Schubert, a historian and academic who's also written several books about the Buffalo Soldiers. And then this becomes a little bit more personal after Frank speaks. So we have Gill Boehringer, who's Boehringer from Australia, who's a former head of the law school at Macquarie University, Sydney, in Sydney, Australia, and he's also taught and researched in universities in the USA, Northern Ireland, England, and Tanzania. He has taught many subjects in law as well as history, and he's going to talk about a very special friendship between the Buffalo Soldiers and the Filipinos. And then last, we're going to have Evangeline Canonizado Buell, who is a direct descendant of one of the Buffalo Soldiers, and she's also an author, and she'll speak about love stories, a particular love story, in fact, between a Buffalo Soldier and a Filipina. So I hand you over to Mark. We'll have questions after the presentations, and you can put your questions in the chat box or in the Q&A box. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, thank you. Hi. Let me welcome everybody. I can't see you, but I'm assuming you can see me. The short video you saw, Zoom is not quite up to handling the technology there correctly, but you got an understanding of what the film is about and a little bit of the story of Buffalo Soldiers and the Philippine-American War. I want to be clear at this point that what you saw was a video promotional film. We are still in the research and development phase of the production. The film is not yet completed. But we filmmakers, it's a tool we use to tell people about the projects we're working on and to get them interested in it. So, as Bambina told you, Danny Glover, Sam Pollard, and a number of other individuals are working with me to complete this documentary film. As she said, it's the the Philippine-American War of 1899. And what's unique about it is the activity of the Buffalo Soldiers in this war. It is a war which, not surprisingly, few Americans and very few Filipinos, at least in America, have heard of. My interest in this war began when I was walking with a friend past the Manila Town building in San Francisco. We decided to go inside, and there I met the then director, Evangeline Lulukisan, who told me about Vanji Canonizado Buell, the granddaughter of a Buffalo soldier and a Filipino. So I said, no, Evelyn, you're confused. You mean it's a love affair between a black soldier who fought in World War II and a Filipino. And she said, no, Mark, you're confused. You're confused, and told me about the war in the Philippines at the turn of the century. And I just couldn't believe it. I just never heard of that war. Because, I know about a lot, I don't know a lot, but I'm pretty cognizant of the many wars that the United States has been in since its creation. Then I did some more reading about the war and ran into a wonderful article by Frank Schubert, who you will meet later in this presentation, about the American rebel David Fagan. After that, I was hooked. I realized the story of Buffalo soldiers and the Philippine-American War would make a great film. So let me tell you a little about my documentary. The focus of the film will be on the Buffalo soldiers, African-American soldiers so named by Native Americans because their kinky hair reminded them of buffalo fur. So these soldiers were brought 10,000 miles from home to fight in the Philippines against the Filipino revolutionaries, who were fighting courageously for their own national sovereignty. The Buffalo soldiers, who themselves were former slaves and sons of former slaves, now were first faced with a dilemma, whether to fight against an oppressed people of color like themselves or not. It was a moral decision which each soldier had to face. So let me set the scene for what was going on in America at this time. After the Civil War came the era of Reconstruction, where Black people were allowed to vote and hold political office. This often spawned an increasingly violent opposition from Southern whites. Social interactions between whites and Blacks often took a violent turn. In 1898, one of the worst race riots in American history occurred in Wilmington, North Carolina, where whites staged a coup d'etat and drove all of the Black elected officials out of office. A mob of 1,500 white men went on a rampage and killed more than 100 Black people. More than 2,000 Black folks then left the city permanently, never to return. At the turn of the 20th century, the United States was on the verge of becoming a major world power. Conflict with Native Americans were over. Defeat of the Sioux at the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1891 had brought the Indian Wars to a close. By 1900, the Indians were on the reservation, and the American buffalo were gone. But for Black folks in post-Reconstruction America, it was a socially precarious environment, dictated solely by the whims of whites. The laws of the land, written to protect all United States citizens, did not apply to them. The 7,000 Buffalo soldiers on their way to the Philippines were not unaware of this apartheid state of affairs in their own country. Now, our film is important not only because the Philippine-American War is not a well-known part of American history, and should be, but also because this war will be viewed from the unique perspective of the African-American soldier who was placed in an unenviable position of fighting in a very controversial war, decried by both prominent whites and prominent Blacks. He was forced to fight a people who not only were brown like him, but also who treated him far better than his white cohorts. We will also view this war through the eyes of the Filipino revolutionaries, who had trouble understanding why America could not see that their fight for freedom, the Filipinos, was similar to our own rebellion against the British. So I'm going to pass you all on to Vicente Rafael, who will tell you more about the geopolitical landscape at the time and take us into the American conflict with the Philippines. Vincent. Where is he?
Yes, hi. Yeah, thanks very much, Mark, for that introduction, and Bambina for allowing me to contribute to this really, really interesting and I think very important seminar. Can you all hear me, by the way? Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay, great.
Yeah, it's here.
Okay, I have a few slides that I wanted to show as I gave my talk. So, and I think Bambina said you would change, you would take care of going through the slides as I gave my little speech, right? Yes, Bambina, is that okay? Hi, Bambina. Can you actually put it on? I can't see it. Hello? Hello? Yeah, great. All right. By way of background, I just wanted to say a few things. I spent about 10 to 15 minutes talking about the larger context of the war that Mark is going to be talking. The rest of the panelists are going to be talking about in various aspects. The Filipino-American War of 1899 to 1902 is, of course, part of a much larger geopolitical conflict. What used to be called the Spanish-American War is actually now called the Wars of 1898. The immediate cause, as you saw from that teaser with Danny Glover, was the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana off the coast of Cuba. But actually, the United States had far longer plans. It was not simply what happened in Cuba, but it really instigated U.S. interest in expansion. Could be shown to go as far back as 1803. Can I have the next slide, please? If you want. Yeah. In 1803, of course, what happened was that, momentous event, which is the Louisiana Purchase under the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, which pointed the young republic into a path of westward expansion. And you can see from the illustration below, westward expansion and colonial settlement, which was made possible by two things. One was through the systematic removal of Native Americans, enslavement of Africans. So the very possibility of expansion, of growth, was, first of all, racially specific to white colonialists, and second, that it was on the back of African slaves and at the expense of Native Americans. So that by the time, can you get the next slide, please? By the time you get to 1898, you can see that the United States had not only managed to get a continental empire, but it had already expanded into many parts of the Pacific Islands as early as 1858. And by the time you got to 1898, you can see all those pockets, especially Alaska. Alaska was a very important acquisition in 1867 because it allowed the United States to sort of literally point its way across the Pacific. Now, so it's not surprising that the first shot of the Spanish-American War was fired not in Cuba, but actually in Manila, when George Dewey on May 1, 1898, who was then docked in Hong Kong, was instructed to go to Manila, and he easily sent the Spanish Armada that was there. However, there was a complication, which was that the United States couldn't hold the Spanish troops with the Navy. They needed ground troops, and in order to get those ground troops, they had to wait for American reinforcements to come from across the Pacific. In the meantime, they turned to Emilio Aguinaldo, who was then exiled in Hong Kong in order to wage a land war against Spain. So on May 18 days after the victory in Manila, they brought him back in from exile. And can I have the next slide, please? They brought him back in from exile, and he then rallied troops, continued the revolution, and won a series of lightning victories over the largely demoralized Spaniards. Essentially, what Aguinaldo did was he bought time for the Americans till the ground troops came. And it was really the Filipinos who were more than anyone else responsible for the defeat of the Spaniards in the archipelago. So successful was Aguinaldo that on June 12, 1898, he managed to proclaim independence. He managed to proclaim independence in the Philippines from his house in Kawit, Cavite, and established a revolutionary government. And by 1898, August of 1898, by August, by the way, can you all hear me? Am I coming in okay?
You're dropping out. Yeah.
I'm dropping out. Okay, I'm trying to speak louder, but it's hard. Okay, so by August of 1898, Filipinos were poised to take Manila from the Spaniards, and this is the key. Just as when the Filipinos were poised to take Manila and complete their victories, the United States forces came in and basically forced them out of their positions. The U.S. made a deal with the Spaniards, conducting a quote-unquote mock battle of Manila Bay, so that the Spaniards refused to surrender to the Filipinos, and the Americans kept the Filipinos out from occupying Manila. Next slide, please. And by August 13, the Americans were able to, as it were, occupy the seat of the former colonial government, forcing Filipinos out, who were then compelled to retreat to Malolos, where they established the first Philippine Republic of 1898. Very much sort of angered by what the Americans had done, which they thought amounted to a deep, deep betrayal. And it was only a matter of time before hostilities got to a boil and shooting started, and the Filipino-American War began. Next slide, please. And you can see from these headlines, in the United States, and this is a slide of the government at Malolos. Next slide, please. You can see from the headlines how the war was to be depicted. Americans thought it was going to be an easy war, that Aguinaldo's troops were no match for the United States, but in fact the war continued a protracted guerrilla warfare for the next 4 years. The question, of course, is why war? Why did the Filipinos fight? Well, for the Filipinos, next slide, please. The war was a continuation of the anti-colonial revolution against Spain, which began in 1896, and for them at stake was nothing less than liberation from colonial rule and protection of its sovereignty. The use of guerrilla tactics on their part was, of course, a response to the superior military forces of the United States. But for the American perspective, next slide, please, that war was essentially a race war. It was a continuation of the Indian Wars from the late 19th century, which pitted civilized whites against inferior natives. The United States simply refused to believe that the Filipinos were capable of self-rule and refused to recognize the Malolos Republic. And that the Treaty of Paris established the right of the United States to determine the fate of Filipinos. The fact that the war had become racialized was very important because it paved the way for an American war of racial extermination, which targeted both Filipino insurgents as well as their civilian supporters in a war, in a very, very brutal war. And this meant that the U.S. Were justified, next slide please, U.S. felt justified in adopting what they called savage tactics to fight savages, including turning villages into concentration camps. Next slide please. Summary killings of prisoners, which are all very familiar tactics from the wars the United States have fought in the past, as well as sort of burning and looting of villages and mass murder. Next slide, please. This slide has selections of letters from soldiers talking about the genocidal glee they felt in killing as many Filipinos and burning as many villages as they possibly can. Next slide, please. They also sort of adopted genocidal policies towards certain communities that had been accused of killing American soldiers, the most famous being the one in Samar, where the General Smith at that time, Jacob Howard Smith, ordered his troops to round up and kill as many people as they possibly could, including any boy older than 10 years old. Next slide, please. And finally, there was the extensive use of torture. Next slide, yeah. Extensive use of torture, most notoriously, which was the water cure. The water cure was so common that soldiers had actually what they called the water cure song, where, and here you can read the association of the water cure with freedom, the typification of Filipinos as with the N-word, which is very common. So it not only was water cure common, it was really celebrated by the soldiers themselves. Finally, the last aspect of the war, and this is something I'll just mention very briefly, was the fact that there were sizable numbers of African-American soldiers, the Buffalo Soldiers, as Mark mentioned, who came, next slide please, to the Philippines, and regarded the war with enormous amounts of ambivalence. Some of them saw it as, in fact, the extension of Jim Crow across the globe, and were decidedly, as I said, reticent to pursue war, thinking that it was, quite unfair to the Filipinos. Finally, the war winds down, and it's despite the fierce guerrilla resistance, Filipinos were driven back by the U.S. military. In March of 1901, Aguinaldo was captured in the wake of celebrating his birthday in northern Luzon. And with the capture of Aguinaldo, the United States convinced him to make a call for other fighters to lay down their guns and to surrender, so that by 1902, July 4 of 1902, Theodore Roosevelt declares the war officially over, despite the fact that Filipino resistance did not totally end and continued for several years, along with sporadic revolts through the 1930s. Next slide, please. Finally, I just wanted to point out what the cost of this war was. For the United States, they sent a total of 126,400 troops, out of which 4,000 died, many from sort of combat-related causes, a lot of sort of drowning in shallow water from being drunk, that sort of thing. 75% from non-combat causes, actually. So in a sense, the United States won the war, but would have to wage the peace. For Filipinos, next slide please, the war was nothing less than catastrophic, unless at least 250,000 were killed. It's a conservative estimate. Many from fighting, as well as starvation, as well as disease. Economic disaster followed, along with cholera epidemics, massive disruptions of the economy, agriculture, food, etc. There was also ecological disaster with the spread of disease and so forth and so on. So that in the end, the war proved to be inconclusive, as most wars are. U.S. colonial policy was shaped against a backdrop of the war and the ever-present fear of war erupting again. And the Philippine-American War, we could see it as part of a late 19th century Indian Wars, as well as the United States. For the United States, it was the first war fought in Asia, and it influenced many of the other wars that the United States would fight in Asia. And for Filipinos themselves, the end of the war was exhausting and totally demoralizing. But however, they never completely gave up. As I said, there were sporadic insurgencies that continued until the 1930s. There was continued desire for freedom, and this was reflected in the campaign for independence. And so in that sense, in many sense, the war, like the revolution before it, remained unfinished. So let me end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Vince. I forgot to, before we go on to Anthony Powell, I forgot to acknowledge that Rick Penn is with us, Frederick Penn, who was just recently retired from the National Park Rangers service, or he's a ranger and just retired from the National Park Service, and he's actually was based in the Presidio where the Buffalo soldiers would take off from, right? Would sail from to go to the Philippines. Mark, would you like to just say a few words about for Anthony? Just introduce Anthony quickly. Hang on. Sorry.
What, could you hear me?
No, they were. Bambina was texting me saying they couldn't hear you. Why did you get angry?
Oh, it did, because you were showing me the phone, but the phone didn't have the text. It had something else on it. So
Then you got so irritated.
because I was confused. It's like you were.
Look, don't believe me.
Sorry, guys. Okay, Mark. Can you unmute, Mark? Mark, can you unmute? Sorry, we're having a few technical issues. Mark, we can't hear you.
Send him a message.
Okay, thanks. Hang on a sec. Let me just.
But we heard you now.
Well, I'm ready to go.
Mark, can you unmute? Is that working? Okay, maybe Anthony, let's just go straight to you. Maybe
All right.
Mark.
Can you hear me well?
Well enough.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, wait, can you hear me?
All
I'm
right.
back.
There's
Hold
Mark.
it.
We've got
I'm
Mark.
back. I'm back. Sorry. Anyway, I just wanted to say that before we get to Anthony, I just want to add on to what Vicente said, which is that upon arriving in this quagmire of a war in the Philippines, Black soldiers saw an enemy combatants who not only were dark like themselves, but who were also fighting against the same white oppression. In this instance, in the form of the American military, as the Black soldiers, had experienced in the US. Bigotry, lynchings, economic privation, etc. Even though these soldiers were far from home, a great degree of racial bigotry existed. White soldiers referred to them, both them and the native Filipinos, and I'm gonna go ahead and use the word because it's a very powerful word and you need to understand what these soldiers were going through. But the white soldiers referred to Filipinos and Buffalo soldiers as niggers. To make things even more confusing for these Black soldiers was the fact that the Filipino liked them and treated them well. One local Filipino man was quoted as saying, referring to the Buffalo soldiers, "They are very much like ourselves. only larger. One soldier related a conversation with a young Filipino boy who said, "Why does the American Negro come to fight us? For we are a friend to him and have not done anything to him. He's all the same as me and me the same as you." Can you hear me?
Yep, yep.
Yes.
The same as you. Why don't you fight those people in America who burn Negroes, that make a beast of you? So the soldier Patrick Mason of the 24th Colored Infantry wrote, this is to emphasize how confused and complicated this war was for a Black soldier. He said, I have not had any fighting to do since I've been here and don't care to do any. I feel sorry for these people and all that has come under control of the United States. The first thing in the morning is the nigger, and the last thing at night is the nigger. You have no idea of the way these people are treated here. But then another soldier, M.W. Sadler, a sergeant in the 25th Colored Infantry, expressed a different perspective. We are now arrayed to meet what we consider to be a common foe, men of our own hue and color. Whether it is right to reduce these people to submission is not for the soldier to decide. Our path of allegiance knows neither race, color, or nation. So the question comes up is, who were these Buffalo Soldiers? And I now turn you over to the noted historian, Anthony Powell, to tell you more about them.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me?
Yes. Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Very good. You know, just as a postscript, the gentleman from the 24th Infantry was killed in action 3 weeks after he wrote that letter off, just to show you how things would happen. You know, today in the 21st century, the Buffalo Soldiers here in America are pretty well known today by a lot of people. One of the problems that I've had over the years is the mythology that has come after the recognition that they have. And what I mean by that is, when you think about a soldier at the end of the Civil War, especially a Black soldier, I have read many times that, people have said they had the less desertion rates in the Army and they were all of these things. But that's not true. The first 20 years of service, especially the first 10, African-American soldiers deserted just as much as whites did. Well, what was the reason? The reason was being in the military service at the end of the Civil War was a very, very hard job to do. Not only did they have to go and repair and rebuild the military posts that had been abandoned during the Civil War, but they were afflicted by disease. I heard several times that this would happen also in the Philippines, but the first 10 to 15 years of their service in the American West, they were afflicted. And if you go back and you look at the reasons why certain soldiers were invalided out of the Army, it was because of the conditions that they served in. Now, is that to suggest that they did not become first-rate soldiers? Indeed, they did. But it was a process. It was a process that took time. Did they have the attitude that most white soldiers had in relationship to defeating Native people? In most instances, they did not, although some did. Most of the time in American history, especially during this particular time, what was the cliche of the average American? The only good Indian is what? A dead Indian. Now, when you think about that, and Native Americans threw this in African Americans' faces, but just think. I've chronicled every engagement that happened from the end of the Civil War to 1893. 85% of the engagements were not John Wayne riding to the rescue. They generally involved African American soldiers. Now, as time went on, they did become an elite force. But at the same time, they were always cognizant of who they were and where they were. I've had letters that I have kept and got from these people over the years, and they mention all of the things that they had to deal with. But what was the reason that they went through all of these things? Let me give you an example that my grandfather gave me. My grandfather served 40 years in the Army from 1887 to 1927. When I was a young buck thinking that I knew everything, I asked my grandfather in the mid-50s, I said, "Granddad, why did you serve this racist nation for all of those years?" And he told me something I would never forget. He said the Army gave him the only part of the American dream that the nation would let him be in. My first response back then was, in the 50s, we called old black men Uncle Toms. And I'm thinking my granddad was an Uncle Tom. Now, it took me a number of years before I could really appreciate what he had said, what he had done. My grandfather was a totally illiterate country boy from Tennessee when he joined the Army in 1887. He was a tall kid, but he was only 13 and a half years old. So what did the Army give him? The Army gave him an opportunity to move up. And the old adage that the Army used to say, join the Army and see the world, it was a reality for my grandfather and his generation of African-American men, because you have to remember, outside the structure of the Army, African-American men did not have much of a chance to improve their lot in life. And the Army did give them this chance by educating them. Most people don't realize that for an enlisted man, whether he be black or white, if he didn't have a formal education, it was mandatory for him to go to the post school. And in the post schools, they generally went to the chaplains were the ones that did the teaching. Generally, the classes were integrated because you would have white troops and black troops at the same post. But it was something that my grandfather appreciated in the long term. I interviewed him and I was trying to pull some of this stuff down. But my grandfather had told me, we did a day of recognition for him in 1974, 5 years before he died at 105 in 1979. And I taped the response he gave me about meeting this great black man. And this great black man, he said, I'm thinking, what was his name? And it turned out to be the name of Frederick Douglass. He said Frederick Douglass walked out on the stage and he put his fingers in his suspenders like old preachers and politicians used to do. And he said these words, he said he would never forget. He said, Frederick said, "Great God, Mr. White Man will never forgive you for creating man black." Now, he says he wasn't able to follow all of it because he was just a little guy, but he did remember that. And so my experience interviewing soldiers, from his generation was that they did not join the Army because of patriotism. They joined the Army because it offered a way up and a way out. And I think that was very important. And as they have been talking, going to the Philippines was something that, again, reminded them, as was said before, about being home. As Patrick Mason said, as was quoted, he says, the first thing in the morning is the nigger and the last thing at night is the nigger. And he said this was done right in front of black soldiers. And he says, well, they weren't talking about we American monkeys, but they're talking about these in the Philippines. And American soldiers listened to that, African Americans, and they took it to heart. Am I suggesting that everyone deserted? No, but there were a few that did desert. And they did something that is purely, in my opinion, an American trait. What do you suppose that is? Freedom and liberty. That is what they were all about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Now, to give us a little bit more background about how they came to the Philippines, I think we're going to turn you over to Rick Penn now. Rick?
Oh, well, the Presidio was one of the staging sites of all of the regiments that did eventually find their way to the Philippines and to Guam. And some of them went as far away as Japan in certain actions. But the Presidio itself became rather famous as a gathering, marshaling place for all the troops, white and black, that fought in the Philippine-American War. What is also significant about their service is that upon their return, when all of these various military units passed through the Presidio, two small companies, about 200 soldiers, actually were stationed semi-permanently for a couple of years on the Presidio. And this was the first time black soldiers had been garrisoned at the Presidio on the West Coast. Mostly they had been in these some somewhat desolate, sometimes Western forts, and some other forts in the places in Montana and Idaho and some of the 11 Western states. But in San Francisco, it was significant because this was where one of the Buffalo soldiers got to be an honor guard and to escort President Teddy Roosevelt around San Francisco. That had never happened before with a black unit in sort of prestigious duty. They also rotated through some of the first ever national parks in the United States, in Sequoia, Kings Canyon, the Big Tree Forest, and Yosemite. And they went there, as with other Army troops, to guard and protect these fledgling national parks that were totally new in the 1890s. And that legacy has only been recently rediscovered by Americans who go to the national parks to know that what park rangers in the United States do today, the Army did in the 1890s, and amongst those Army troops were African-American soldiers. So they were essentially amongst the first park rangers. Ken Burns has a great documentary on the national parks, and he has a segment on the Buffalo Soldiers there. The Buffalo Soldiers returning from the Philippine-American War, like in many wars, almost in all the wars, there has always been a hope amongst African-American civilians and politicians that by giving a blood sacrifice to the country, this will somehow raise your stature, give you a greater standing and recognition amongst the other white civilians, that somehow this will show them. This will be the thing that will cause that surge of brotherhood, that they will rise above all of this racism and be accepted as full-class citizens. And that continued even up into Vietnam. And I think we can see with the movement of Black Lives Matter that has still something that we've yet to really get beyond, and which is not to take away from what the military has done. Like Anthony said, it was one of the first organizations in the United States, the military, that gave African Americans some part of the American dream that they could aspire to, and learn to live with and to be proud of, to be a part of a long tradition of the U.S. military. And the military has, since the days of the Buffalo Soldiers, been a more egalitarian and meritorious service for African Americans to join and to be treated with some degree of dignity and equality. So there are definitely historical precedents for African Americans joining the military. But the Presidio at that time in the 1890s was that one place where African American soldiers, after the Philippine-American War, were stationed, and with their one remaining black officer, Charles Young. When Charles Young was leading those black soldiers at the Presidio, Young was actually invited to give a commencement speech at Stanford University outside of San Francisco, and that had never happened before. So there are definitely some significant landmarks, milestones that happen at the Presidio that the Rangers always invite the public to come there and walk in the steps of the Buffalo Soldiers. And when they do, we do talk about what we're talking about tonight, and that is the moral dilemma of the Buffalo Soldiers going into places where there were people of color fighting for their own independence, and African Americans not even experiencing the full degree of citizenship at home, and what it took to do that, and how it tore these men apart.
Thank you, Vic. Thanks so much for that. I'll turn you over now to Frank Schubert, who is an American author and military historian. He's written several books about the Buffalo Soldiers, and also by way of background, he was a chief of Joint Operational History in the Joint History Office of the Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, until his retirement in 2003. Thanks, Frank.
I would like to think of that as kind of a federal work release program where I turn myself into federal authorities every morning and then they let me go home at night. But anyway, I want to thank the organizer, thank Mike Harris, for inviting me to participate in this. I'm 77 years old. I don't involve myself very much with Buffalo Soldier history anymore, and have given my papers to the Kansas City, Missouri Library Special Collections Department. But when a conference organizer or editor remembers that I'm not dead, and I still might know something, I can't resist the chance to sign on. So here I am, okay? And I'm gonna talk about David Fagan and who he might have been, what the army in which he served was doing, and some of the factors that might have influenced his choices. And I say might have been because David Fagan was young and barely literate, and he left nothing that might explicitly tell us these things. Yet he became the celebrated Fagan because of his audacity as a leader of revolutionary troops, known to the New York Times as the celebrated Fagan. You read it in the paper and obviously they expect everybody to know who the celebrated Fagan is. So much, and he was so important, so celebrated that Brigadier General Frederick Funston, who was kind of the anti-Fagan in the public imagination, the popular face of American imperialism in the Philippines and the captor of Emilio Aguinaldo, felt compelled in his memoir to make an excuse for not managing to kill Fagan. Had him in his sights, he said, but he ran out of ammunition. Damn. And his sister-in-law, we learned, Mike Robinson and I, when we were doing this research, when we looked at Funston's papers, she jerked his chain and chided him about this at the family dinner table back in Kansas. And of course, to top things off, Fagan's name is almost too good to be true. He was not the first villain known to Western culture as Fagan. Now, we do have to start with, and some of the preceding speakers have, with the role of Black soldiers in Western expansion, where their primary duty for 30 years or so was, whether directly in combat or not, involved the pauperization and dispossession of the native population west of the Mississippi. And this was a central drama of American history, what used to be called the winning of the West, and it became a part of American mythology. The spread of the nation, its population, its values, its way of life, and the concomitant expropriation of native groups. Now, Black soldiers wrote about their experiences in these wars. They wrote about it in pension requests. They wrote about it in Winners of the West, the National Indian War Veterans magazine. They wrote about it in the Black press. And let me tell you, the Black soldier, these Indians were redskins, they were naked savages, they were red devils, just like they were to whites. And just to make sure you understand, because this is significant in terms of the difference with the Philippines, these people were not monotheists, the Indians. They were not literate. They were semi-nomadic warrior hunters representing a way of life totally different from and considered inferior to the agricultural industrial society in which the Black soldier was trying to make his way. And along the way, the soldiers, perhaps to align themselves with the majority, adopted the views and the values and the expressions of the majority. They caricatured and they mocked their enemies. This process of winning the West was still going on when David Fagen was born in 1880 in Tampa, when the black-white racial situation in the United States was deteriorating and the South was institutionalizing a new two-tiered racial system. Didn't have slavery, but it was still a two-tiered racial system built around segregation and Jim Crow. And at the same time, blacks were pushing back during Fagen's youth. And there were incidents in Texas, there was an incident in Tampa, there was an incident in Lakeland, Florida, where black soldiers reacted with violence, responded with violence to white violence. And so this is part of the culture in which Fagen grew up. Now, he did serve in the hospital at Siboney, the yellow fever hospital, and then he went to the Philippines with his comrades in 1899. And what he and they saw in the Philippines was a largely white army imposing the same racial system that existed in the US. Now, even if we accept, we have to remember, even if we accept the figure of 7,000 Buffalo soldiers, and 4 regiments never did add up to 7,000 soldiers, and we look at the 120-some thousand soldiers who were in that army in the Philippines, we're talking about 5% more or less of that army that fought in the Philippines. And of course, they saw the population in the Philippines, the enemy, differently from other non-white enemies that they had encountered on the frontier. And this is of course essential. These people were Christians, they wore pants, they came from a literate culture, they lived in cities, and like has been already said, whites called them the same despicable names they used to describe Black Americans, goo-goos, black devils, and that familiar word that starts with N. Black soldiers processed their encounters with Filipinos in different ways than their earlier service against Native Americans. But of course, not all of them took the same path as Fagen. They all doubtlessly talked about these things. They came to their own conclusions based on their personal values and backgrounds and aspirations, their experiences and considerations of the risk. The number of black defectors, large enough to scare the hell out of military officialdom, was actually very small. And I'll get to the specifics in a minute, except that it suggested the possibility of an uprising by many more soldiers, armed, trained, and mad enough to turn against the government and service in the war. The hanging of Edmund Dubose and Lewis Russell, 2 9th Cavalry soldiers who defected and were captured, and were the only defectors executed. It's almost like George Floyd. It's a different kind of justice for blacks than the justice for whites. And the obsession with Fagen, Dubose and Russell, and the obsession with Fagen illuminate this concern, this fear among the white leadership. About the numbers, there were 67 black deserters in 6 regiments in 1899 to 1902. That's the 9th and the 10th Cavalry, the 10th and the 24th and 25th Infantry, and the 48th and 49th Volunteer Infantry. 67 deserters. 27 of those desertions took place in the Philippines. And Mike Robinson and I identified 9 as actual defectors. Not a big number, except when compared to 0 for 35 years on the frontier. There was desertion in the West. A man might enlist, get transportation to the West, then disappear in Denver or in the gold digging somewhere. And after the Pine Ridge campaign, which we all know about with the massacre at Wounded Knee, in 1890-91, William Wilson of the 9th Cavalry, who received the Medal of Honor, then he deserted. He went home to Hagerstown, Maryland, and nobody ever came looking for him, and he lived there for 30 years. So desertion wasn't seen the same way exactly as it was in the Philippines. In the Philippines and in the Philippines for the deserting soldier, this was different. You didn't desert and go home. Desertion in the Philippines carried the risk of permanent severance of ties with home, family, and culture. And it's like George Rawick said about revolution, men do not make revolution for light and transient reasons. These guys were not defecting for light and transient reasons because the risk was tremendous. We ID'd, by the way, Mike Robinson and I, Mike's been long dead, he was a dear friend of mine. We ID'd 21 white deserters in the same period, but only from the public press in the Philippines, not in regimental records. So there probably were more. After all, they were the vast majority of the Army. Now, in Fagan's case, we cannot document the extent to which external factors interacted with personal considerations, okay? We know these external factors, we've just kind of gone over them in a broad way. It could have been poor relations with his officers, perceived and or real mistreatment involving being singled out for duties that were in some ways particularly onerous. It could have been, there was a woman in his life, a Filipino woman. We do know that he was a competent leader of small elements of Filipino revolutionary forces in what seemed to have been small independent operations. And by the way, here we have to pause for a moment. My wife called this to my attention and asked, how did he do that? Specifically, how did he communicate with his men? This was a young guy with no education. Now he comes from Tampa. He might have known some Spanish, okay? But still there's a question of how did he communicate with the Filipino revolutionaries, and maybe they didn't all know Spanish, who were under his command. And this is a question I don't think we'll ever get an answer to, but I think it's important to think about. But we do know that whatever language he communicated in, he was good at what he did. There were the newspapers, from the New York Times to the Manila Times to little town newspapers like the Tribune in Crawford, Nebraska, near one of my favorite forts, Fort Robinson. There were memoirs from Funston to Jake Ganshorn, an Arizona gunslinger who served as a volunteer infantryman and barely escaped with his life an encounter with Fagan soldiers. We know that the American military leadership was familiar with him and his example, that this man in particular, and the issue of Black defection became an obsession within the War Department, despite the almost trivial number of men involved. And there was good reason why he was called the celebrated Fagan. There were posters offering a reward for Fagan, dead or alive, all over Luzon after a while. And we know the case of Sergeant Calloway and his Filipino friend Thomas Consumi, which I think will be talked about in more detail subsequently in this session, that even the mention of possible sympathy for the Filipino cause was enough to get a competent non-commissioned officer sent home and dishonorably discharged and have his career ruined. Fittingly, we don't know what happened to Fagan after a bounty hunter sprang a surprise attack on him in the autumn of 1901. Dispersed Fagan's comrades and turned over to the Army a, quote, slightly decomposed head of a Negro, unquote, and claimed the reward. Mike and I never found any indication that the bounty was paid, and neither has anyone else as far as I know. Other possibilities, Fagan maybe colluded with the bounty hunter to produce a slightly decomposed head that would get the authorities off his back. Or the bounty hunter thought he could bring in a head and cash in on Fagan's notoriety. Certainly a head in an uncertain state of preservation was not indisputable evidence. Fagan was known to be of short stature. He was in a part of Luzon populated by Negritos, diminutive Black people among whom an appropriate head would have been readily available. Later, there were occasional rumors of Fagan sightings, but nothing verifiable. Mike and I figured he could have lived a long and happy life in the Nueva Ecija outback where Jim Crow could not go. In any case, Fagan in death remains as elusive as he was when he was alive.
Thank you so much, Frank. I think you meant to say Nueva Ecija, right? Where Fagan might have been.
Right.
It's kind of a little north of Manila. Mark?
Neither my English
Yeah.
nor my Hungarian would accommodate that.
Mark, I'm gonna turn over to you now if you'd like to just introduce Gill and Vanji. Hang on, Mark.
Yeah,
Okay.
can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Oh, goody. Goody. Anyway, thank all of you all. Thank you, Frank. David Fagan is a fascinating character. Drove the American military crazy at the time. Would even taunt them and say, come and catch me if you can. And whether they did or not, to me, he's kind of like a hero who rides off into the sunset. So anyway, the war didn't necessarily have strong demarcation lines. So that in this war of brutality with concentration camps and waterboarding and executions, there's a lighter note that went on. Friendships and love stories. The one I want to introduce you to now is a friendship that developed between the U.S. Sergeant Major General John Calloway and Filipino Tomas Consunji. And I'm going to let Gill Boehringer carry this on.
Two friends on the panel.
You're
Can you
on,
hear?
you're on. Yeah.
You can hear? Okay. Thanks to the organizers, and especially I'd like to thank Anthony Powell and Frank Mickey Schubert, who were actually mentors of mine, although much younger. John Calloway's life story is a fascinating one, and I want to put it into context and talk about how he came to the Philippines with one point of view and ended up with another, and how the friendship with Thomas Consunji was so important. I think of Calloway's life as a prism through which we can observe the complexities and contradictions of life in late 19th century imperialist and racist America, in its military and in its relations with peoples of its colonies. And there's much of interest and relevance for today. In a sense, as you will see or hear, Calloway could be said to be a bit of an odd man out here. We're talking about Buffalo soldiers, defectors, deserters, etc. He was neither. He was not a deserter nor a defector. Nevertheless, he was terribly persecuted merely for his friendship with Filipinos, in particular two, Dr. Santos of Manila and Thomas Consunji of San Fernando, Pampanga. By the way, the main street, boulevard, actually along the river in San Fernando is called Consunji Drive. We'll get to his family later. Calloway's grandfather was actually a wealthy white landowner of an old Virginia family. His grandmother was a slave woman who had been given to him, as they did, by his family. He was an older man, and this young slave woman was there to take care of him. As the saying goes, one thing led to another, and they had a son, the father of John Calloway, who was actually freed at the death of the old planter. Calloway's mother was from a family of freeborn coloreds. John was given a very good education, spoke, read, and wrote English with great fluence. He was born in 1872. So he lived through the first 5 years of Reconstruction, but then grew to maturity within the white backlash, including from the KKK, which was developing at that time. And probably because of both his good education and the developing circumstances of repression and lynching and so forth, he moved to Boston, was trained as a printer, but due to the constant recessions and panics and so forth, which we've heard from by Anthony, he decided to join the Army, and he put his occupation down as a printer. So it was a temporary move on his part. He actually re-enlisted in 1894 and again in 1899. And in 1899, he put down his occupation as soldier. Now, he served with both 25th and the 24th Infantry Regiments, and indeed was part of the repression and near extinction of the native population, First Nations or Indian people in the West. But there was something else that the Black soldiers were asked to do. And as Anthony said, they became special troops, special forces in a sense. And they were sent in against the striking miners and railroad workers in Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. There didn't seem to be any conflict of conscience at that time with John Calloway. He was promoted in '95. Each time he re-enlisted, his performance and his character were rated as excellent. He, like the others in the Black regiments, was sent to Cuba. And they fought extremely well, valiantly. And as an aside, Teddy Roosevelt always gets credit for taking San Juan Hill. But in fact, they were held down by Spanish snipers. And it was one of the Black regiments that actually saved Teddy. So that's another part of the story of the Buffalo Soldiers that isn't told. In Cuba, Calloway and Fagan, and by the way, there's an interesting connection here. So I've been studying both of them, but Calloway, as a regimental sergeant major, actually signed the enlistment papers of David Fagan when he was going to be shipped to Cuba. In Cuba, both of them volunteered, as did many hundreds of the Black soldiers, to stand guard and to care for those who were sick in what was called a pest camp in Siboney, near Guantanamo. But fortunately, neither of them died, as many of the people in that camp did. Okay, so they've come back from Cuba, and then many of the soldiers were demobilized, but then they had to go to the Philippines, and a number re-enlisted, and of course, they were sent from the Presidio. Another interesting thing, and Rick's talk about the Presidio is very interesting, but here again, Calloway is actually an odd man out. He ended up in prison in the Presidio, but again, I'll get to that later. Okay, so in July 1899, the Black troops get to the Philippines. By November, we see letters written, and Anthony referred to Patrick Mason. He was also in by this time, he and Calloway were in the same regiment, 24th. And Mason wrote this amazing letter attacking white racism in the country and racism against both the black soldiers and the Filipinos. And he was probably in discussions with other sergeants and sergeant majors. They probably knew each other, Calloway and Mason. Calloway wrote a letter about the same time back to the Richmond Planet. And it's interesting, the white newspapers paid correspondents to go to the Philippines to write the war up. And of course, you can imagine the hoopla, the triumphalism that one would find in their stories. But the black newspapers, of which there were about a dozen in major cities, hadn't the finance to send correspondents. So the black soldiers were their correspondents. They wrote to the newspapers telling them what was happening. These have all been collected in two excellent volumes by a historian, an American historian, and from which we get a lot of our information. Calloway was obviously a very bright guy, very interested in what was going on around him. And he asked the questions in some of his letters, what am I doing here? How do these people think about us? And so he decided to do a social survey. And he began to interview people there, including Dr. Santos in Manila. And they had and this is written up, and he sent this back to the Planet, actually. And Calloway had a discussion with him about the attitude of the Filipinos towards the white and the black soldiers. And it's a very interesting conversation. And Santos said, you're foreigners, you're here, you know, we can't, he actually said, we can't be too friendly with you. But he said, look, we see the racism of these white soldiers. We never knew anything about racism in the United States. He said, it wasn't an issue for us even with the Spanish. He said, that was all political. But these white soldiers have been telling us how you're going to rape our women, how you're savages, etc. And he said, but we've noticed the difference. He said, you do your duty, but kindly and manly. It's not clear how this sergeant met Thomas Kasunji. I suspect maybe Dr. Santos told him, look, there's this chap up in San Fernando, and if you ever go up that way, look him up, which he did. The 24th, with both Calloway and Fagan, moved north. And when he was in San Fernando, or near there, Calloway looked up Thomas Kasunji. And the Kasunjis had him over for a meal. And then, as a good American lad, he wrote a bread and butter letter. And unfortunately, that letter caused a great tragedy. In the letter, Calloway talked thanked the Kasunjis for having him there and so forth, and give my regards to your sisters who I didn't meet, but I understand they're lovely people, blah, blah, blah. But he then started talking about the immorality of the war and how if it was up to him, they would have their freedom immediately. And there were other expressions of sympathy for the Filipinos. You will get your freedom someday, you know, and basically encouraging them to keep up the fight. And Calloway was a great admirer of Booker T. Washington, and he had written to the Planet saying how all the boys were talking about it. And so he emphasized the importance of education educate, 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 he said to Thomas. But he also seems to have been thinking about his own future and what it might be like to stay there. And he asked Thomas, what would be the feeling of the Filipinos if some of us immigrated, or, you know, if we stayed on and developed a business and lived here as your neighbors? And Thomas said, look, he said, I have no doubt that you would be treated well, that you would be treated as good neighbors. He said, one thing we need is development. And we're anxious to get ideas from the Occident. I love the way they talked in those days. And he said, look, what we really need is this knowledge and in order to have our development, but we want it to be taught to us by people of color. So he and Thomas had a really good, honest, open relationship, and a great deal of respect for each other just comes across in the letters and the discussions that they had. Now, unfortunately, Thomas and Feliciano Jackson had been gun runners in the Spanish War with the Filipinos. And they were actually caught at one point running guns in from Hong Kong for the revolutionaries. So the Spanish had them under surveillance, and I suppose that the Spanish handed over a list to the Americans. They were quite friendly, of course, as we've learned about the mock battle to save the reputation of the Spanish, so they could go home with some pride. Anyway, a year after this letter was written, the Kansunji's house was raided, the letter was found, and to make a quite long and complicated story short, Callaway was railroaded out of the Army. He was leading a sergeant major, regimental sergeant major. He was put out on parade and broken to privates. And the recommendation was that he should be discharged without honor and sent back to the United States, not to return. And at that point, there was a little bit of racial profiling going on, because there was concern that if he was dealt with and then allowed to stay on, he would join with Fagan and the others. And in every chain of command through which that recommendation moved, this was always a part of the fear. As Frank was saying just before me, there was this fear. In fact, there's documentation that the US government actually was very much afraid of the growing friendliness between the soldiers and the Filipinos. And in fact, they were withdrawn before the whites were. And also they weren't sent to China. Remember, 2 regiments were sent to China from the Philippines, not the last time that the Philippines was used by the Americans in their imperialist wars. But, the English, French, Germans, Russians, everybody was getting a concession in China. So the Americans wanted to gobble up some ground and ironically, they wanted to get a market for their overproduction of commodities. A footnote here on Callaway. Having been sent back to the United States because of his poor conduct, he returned, paid his own way, and he got a job. But unfortunately, he was recognized by a former officer in the 24th Regiment, and he was turned in. He was working as a guard, and nothing was done. So this officer went again, this time to a higher office, and said, look, Calloway's in the country. He's a bad man. He's got to go. And General MacArthur, the older one, said, yes, send him and don't let him come back. He's a dangerous man. He'll join with Fagan, etc., the same stuff. Calloway was sent back to the US, but then returned. And I kept wondering, why is this guy coming back to the Philippines all of the time? And it was at that point I decided to move on in my research. I had followed Calloway up to about 1904, I think. And then I wrote a small article in the Philippine Daily Inquirer about Calloway. And about a year later, I get an email from Becca Calloway, who's one of our watchers, saying that John W. Calloway was her grandfather. And so then I began to get the real story. And the reason he kept going back was that his wife was there, and they lived together until 1934 and had 14 children. I've written a paper in which I talk about imperial paranoia, the persecution of Calloway and his redemption. What was his redemption? He never actually got satisfaction from the American government, never got a review of what was a kangaroo court. But when he died, there was an article in the Tribune newspaper, "Old Timer Dies." And it was a lovely tribute to this man without any reference to the controversy about his discharge and so forth. And there was a nice little piece at the end in which it said, and his daughter Maggie will be known to you as she is a very popular vaudeville entertainer and dancer. So he was redeemed in the eyes of the Filipinos, and Thomas Kansunji's prediction came true. He was considered a good neighbor.
Okay. Thank you, Gill. Thank you. Very touching story. So before we conclude, I would like to introduce everybody to Evangeline Canonizado Buell, who is the author of the book 25 Chickens and a Pig for a Bride. And she will tell you about the very touching story about her grandparents, the love affair and eventual marriage between her grandfather, a Buffalo soldier, and her grandmother, a Filipina. So, Vanjie. Hello. Did everybody hear me?
Yeah, Vanjie, are you there? Hang on.
There.
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. My grandfather, Ernest Stokes, was born in Chattanooga, Tennessee around 1870. Grandpa Stokes wanted to escape from the South, where he experienced oppressive racial prejudice. In 1898, he found an opportunity to leave for an overseas assignment, hoping for a life free from discrimination in another country. He responded to a call for volunteers for the Spanish-American War in the Philippines and traveled with a group from Tennessee to San Francisco to receive training at the Presidio Army camp. The windy and cold military base on the scenic hills overlooked the Golden Gate Bridge, the gateway to the Pacific Ocean. Grandpa Stokes and the other Tennessee volunteers would cross the largest and deepest sea in the world to fight a war in a land they knew nothing about. Later on in life, Grandpa Stokes explained to his second wife, Roberta, "We had to leave this deplorable country, even if it meant facing the unknown. At least we had a chance for a new destiny, perhaps a better life than here." In 1902, Grandpa Stokes married Maria Bunag, the daughter of Gregoria Rodriguez, a native of Peñaranda, Nueva Ecija. They had 3 daughters who were born at Fort Stotzenberg, later known as Clark Air Base, located in the province of Pampanga. Despite the prejudice that he still experienced in the United States Army, it seemed that Grandpa Stokes had finally fulfilled his dream to find a better life outside the United States. He loved the Philippines, its people, culture, and customs. Grandpa learned to speak Chinese and Spanish and local dialects like Ilocano, Kapampangan, Tagalog, and Visayan. He communicated with Filipinos in their own dialect and enjoyed the local food, including the strong-smelling bagoong, a salty paste of fermented fish or shrimp. At home, he ate peasant-style, using his fingers to dip the grilled fish in bagoong, scoop it up with the rice, and thumb it into his mouth with relish. He washed the dinner down with a glass of tuba, a potent local wine made of palm sap, and ended the meal with a satisfied sigh, with a compliment to his wife. Ay, masarap ang pagkain. Oh, the food is delicious. In 1923, Grandpa Stokes met Roberta Dunca, and this was after Maria Bunag died, and that was like 17 years after she died. A beautiful and vivacious 16-year-old from Angeles, Pampanga, where his army base was located. She was 30 years younger than my grandfather, who was then in his late 40s, and was only a few months older than his eldest child, Felicia, my mother. Grandpa was deeply in love with Roberta and wanted to marry her and bring her back to the States. She was the first woman he had considered marrying since the death of his wife, Maria. But he was racked with doubts as to whether she would reciprocate his feelings or whether his parents would approve the relationship. Though Roberta was unsure about Grandpa because of their age difference, she thoroughly enjoyed his company, appreciated that he spoke her Kapampangan dialect, and thought that he looked handsome in his uniform. Grandma Roberta already knew that the dashing soldier wanted more than friendship from her. He had often told her, Talaguran Taka, I love you, in Kapampangan, even in the presence of her older brother, who was their ubiquitous chaperone during their courtship. Grandpa Stokes, desperate to make Roberta his wife, decided to take matters in his own hands. One evening, he took the young woman, accompanied by her brother, to a party in one of the villages. After hours of dancing and merriment, they returned to Roberta's home and found her mother and father on the veranda, waiting for him to bring their daughter back. Grandpa found the perfect opportunity to implement his plan. Fully aware that Filipinos forbade kissing during courtship, and only marriage could save the family's honor if such customs were violated, he grabbed Roberta, put his arms around her, and kissed her in front of her shocked parents. Her angry father blurted out the words that her daughter's suitor had been secretly wanting to hear. You have to marry her immediately. While still reluctant to wed a much older man, Roberta knew that she could not break an honored tradition. Her parents also had misgivings about their daughter marrying Grandpa, but they had to save face and allowed the wedding to take place. Grandpa left the country in 1928. Grandpa Stokes and Roberta sailed for the United States, and her parents' worst nightmare would be fulfilled. Their daughter would never have a chance to visit the Philippines and see her family again. Grandma Roberta had cried for days in her mother's arms before their departure, and every day on the ship bound for San Francisco. Once in the States, Grandpa helped his wife, who was illiterate, to write letters to her family and read their letters to her. He fulfilled his promise to make her happy and provide a stable home for her. But it took Grandma Roberta a long time to forgive him for kissing her in front of her parents. We always had a chaperone whenever we went out together, and he never touched me. But he was worried that someone else might come along, she told me. I learned to love your grandpa only after we arrived here. It broke my heart to leave the country. I'm still very lonesome for my parents. Like Grandpa Stokes, many of the African-American soldiers who had remained in the Philippines after the Spanish-American War eventually returned to the United States with their Filipino wives in the late 1920s and early 1930s. His friends, Brown, Hawkins, James, Jones, McQuinney, Nicholas, and Pitts, who also settled in the Bay Area. The men taught their wives to play poker, and they spent many evenings partying and playing cards together. The grandpas loved reminiscing about the Philippines and held the children's attention with stories about their adventures. Grandpa Stokes and Grandma Roberta lived in West Oakland, together with my father Stanley and my mother Felicia. Grandpa had retired from the Army, and my father was in the Navy stationed on Gill Boehringer Island between Oakland and San Francisco. There were very few Filipinos and African Americans in West Oakland in the 1930s, and these minority groups had difficulty finding housing because of racial discrimination. Therefore, extended families tended to stay together to survive, especially during the Depression. After countless rejections from landlords, Grandpa and Grandma were able to rent the upper flat in an old Victorian home right there in West Oakland. Although Grandpa and Grandma did not have children of their own, they had a house full of kids. They had adopted my cousin Rosario, right after she was born in 1932, because she was abandoned by her mother, my Aunt Theodora. Because we were the same age, we were raised as sisters and dressed alike as twins. Grandpa would sit us on his lap and sing to us in Tagalog and Spanish, bouncing up and down to the rhythm of the songs. He also taught us how to count in Chinese. When my sister Rosita was born in 1934, the whole family, especially Grandpa, was thrilled to have another addition to the brood. While Grandpa took care of amusing the children, Grandma handled the task of nourishing the growing family. Grandpa taught Grandma how to cook American, including Southern soul food from his native Tennessee and other cuisines, helping us to develop a multicultural palate. Fried chicken that had been soaked in buttermilk, mashed potatoes, cream gravy, sausage bread dressing, spaghetti and lemon and sweet potato pies. Grandma learned to bake biscuits, but she always served rice no matter what else was on the menu. Even now, my sister Rosita must have rice with every meal. Grandpa died in February 1936 when I was just 4 years old. I was left with a few but very fond memories of him. 2 years later, Grandma married Manuel Onabia. Since Filipinos were then barred from buying real estate property, one of the Grandpa's friends helped Grandma and Uncle Manuel by placing his name on the deed for the house that the couple had bought for $5,000. He said that before Grandpa Stokes died, he had asked him to take care of Roberta and the grandchildren in case anything happened to him. Berta, Sergeant Stokes was like a brother to me, and I'm glad I can help you in this way. May you be happy and secure in this house, the helpful Grandpa stated. When it finally became legal for Filipinos to buy homes, he turned over the deed to Grandma, who changed the title in her name. Every Memorial Day, Grandpa Grandma and Uncle would gather flowers from our garden to bring to Grandpa Stokes' burial place. On one such visit, Auntie Dominga and her daughter Dot joined us at our vigil at the cemetery. Grandma began telling stories about her life with Grandpa, while Uncle arranged the flowers carefully over Grandpa's grave. As we held hands, Uncle addressed us children. He was a brave man, and he loved you and your grandma very much. You must always be proud of him and your Filipino and Negro heritage. Buffalo soldier Ernest Stokes is buried in the Presidio in San Francisco, where in 1898 he trained as a soldier before sailing for his assignment to fight in the Spanish-American War in the Philippines. His brave journey to find a better life had begun and ended on a windy hill that now looks down on a monument honoring the Tennessee volunteers who fought in foreign wars.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Vanjie.
Thank you.
So,
yeah, that was really fascinating. I mean, so much about, you know, the relationship between America and the Philippines that we didn't know about. It's been really eye-opening. Every one of you has been amazing. I think we have time for some questions as well.
I'd like to make a comment. May I make a comment about the Buffalo Soldiers and what they did take to the Philippines? And that is they took jazz. They introduced jazz in the Philippines and Negro spirituals.
Wow. Have there been any of the music? Has it somehow been imbibed in Philippine music? Would you know?
What is that?
No, any of like the jazz or the Negro baby gospel music, has it somehow filtered? Would you know if it's filtered into Philippine music, popular music?
Yes, it has. As far as I know, yes, because I was there 3 times, and I've been to a lot of the clubs where they played fabulous jazz. And we have wonderful Filipino jazz musicians, even right here in the United States. Carlos Salcita is one of them, and I'm sure maybe you might have heard of him in the Philippines, because he plays both in the Philippines and here. Beautiful jazz.
Great. And I also just want to mention we have some descendants here. Apart from Vanjie, we have descendants of John Calloway as well, who joined us today.
Oh, yes.
We're so honored to have all of you. And now, yeah, if you have any questions, please, we'd love to. I'm sure the panel would love to take some questions.
I know Gill. I know that William Gatewood wrote the book called "The Smoked Yankees," where he gathered the newspaper stories from the soldiers from the Philippine-American War. I read most of that book. One story in particular. There was a soldier who says that he was in Peking. One African-American soldier said he was in Peking, but I haven't been able to substantiate that anywhere.
Maybe I can answer that.
I don't know. I'd be surprised, but anything was happening in those days. Yes, go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, you know, that was very true. The 9th Cavalry had been slated to go to China, and they had an advance section that was there. I forget how many men. It may have been six soldiers or a dozen, but indeed they were there. The rest of the regiment was diverted to the Philippines during that time.
Okay.
Gill, I think there's a question for you. They were asking about Becca's sister is here, Becca's wondering what initiated your interest in her grandfather's story, and
it's very circuitous. I've always been interested in human rights lawyers, and in fact, one of my main projects now is the killing of human rights lawyers around the world. And by the way, the Philippines is the #1 and has been, with Mexico and Brazil, in the top 3 for killings of lawyers. which is an epidemic around the world, and there are all sorts of reasons, but I don't have time to go into that. But there was a fascinating lawyer from the United States, a man called Heber Smith, who was, I wouldn't exactly call him a human rights lawyer, but he was against authority, and he loved defending people. And when Galloway was going to be sent back to the United States, he was on the transport Grant. Some friends of his, and he had many friends in Manila and elsewhere, friends of his retained a lawyer, an American lawyer, who argued that there should be a proper process, because he hadn't had one, and got he applied for a writ of habeas corpus, and the problem was that the army was very resistant to that, the military, and in any case, the lawyer was not fully qualified. He was new to the Philippines. So the friends of Calloway looked around for another guy, and they got Heber Smith, who had been through all kinds of battles in many states of the United States, in Canada, and then when he went to the Philippines, he was a top criminal defense lawyer, and he was at that moment handling a big case. So Heber Smith tried and tried to get a proper court hearing, but the military contended, look, we're not going to do this. Out of respect for the judiciary, we've allowed Calloway to come off the grant, but we're not going to have a hearing. We have jurisdiction over him. We've arrested him. The civilian authorities, therefore, have no jurisdiction over him. And this case was written up in the first volume of the Philippine Law Reports, and it was subsequently used in many cases as a precedent. And the court said unanimously, you're right. The military's arrested him. Bye-bye, Calloway. Get back on the transport and go back to San Francisco. It would be interesting for a Filipino law student or researcher to look into all the uses of that case as a precedent. It just represents the repressive nature of the state, because it was clear to everyone who knew anything about the case that Calloway was being railroaded. You know, the first charge they brought against him, the only real charge, was bigamy. This is a crazy story. Somebody had written on his file, maybe back in Washington, not Calloway, that he was a married man. Now, I've looked through, Ancestor.com and et cetera, et cetera. There's no way that he was married. We just cannot find any instance that he was married. But the military was very upset that he was having a relationship with Mamerta de la Rosa from Santa Rosa. I think also in Nueva Ecija. That's an interesting place. A lot of revolutionaries come from there, and a lot of the main battles were fought there, even in the time of the Japanese, when the Hooks fought them. The court-martial didn't know what to do about this charge of, it was actually a charge of bad conduct and lack of discipline. But they couldn't prove that he was married, and they didn't know that he was actually, at that time, they didn't know he was married to the Filipino woman. So it was completely ridiculous. Even the officers in the court-martial couldn't handle it, so they acquitted him. But the military wanted to get him, and they just went ahead, and he ended up
They needed to make an example of somebody.
out of the army.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah. No, they needed to make an example of someone.
That's right. Yes. To encourage the others, as the French say. Yeah. Yeah. So that was it was a very circuitous route to Callaway through my interest in lawyers, human rights lawyers. By the way, I'll tell you a funny little incident. I was going to a play reading group in Manila one day, and this chap who knew me over the years said, "What's your project now?" And I said, "Oh, I'm interested in a tax on lawyers." And he looked at me and smiled. He said, "I think a tax on lawyers is a very good idea." I love the Philippines. It all happens there.
Are you allowed to come back, Gill?
No,
No.
Turkey has banned me. And one of the people looking on is also banned. And in fact, several of the people looking on are also banned. Duterte, and sad to say, you know, there was a killing yesterday. A Facebook friend.
Are you okay, Gill?
Yeah. If you're a critic of Duterte, you get killed if you're in the Philippines. I was lucky. They just red tagged me, said I was a supporter of communist terror groups. And that's the way they handle you. And the worrying thing is, the Filipinos are sending military delegations to other countries, I believe South Korea and several in Europe and here in Australia, to red tag people here and to even threaten Filipino Australians to associate with those who are red tagged. Both individuals and organizations have been red tagged. It's a very bad government that we're faced with.
Terrorism comes in many forms, right?
Yeah.
I have a question just still on the subject of Callaway, I have a question for you, Rick. Can someone visit the grave of Callaway at the Presidio? Is it
No.
easy? No.
I'll answer that.
Go ahead, take the Gill.
Yeah. I've tried to find the grave. It's in North Cemetery. When I went there to look for it, I told that, you know, there are a lot of guys sitting on, it's a huge cemetery.
Yeah.
In which a lot of people live, of course. Wonderful housing for the poor. They should open it up for that. But anyway, the guys sitting there on the well, I can't remember the word, you know, the motorcycles. Some Filipino tell me, what, I can't think of the word. Anyway, they're sitting on these means of transport, waiting for some tourist.
The jeepneys. The jeepneys.
No, the little
Tricycles.
huh?
Tricycles.
Yeah, tricycle. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's a Tagalog word, I think. Yeah, they didn't know that there had been a war, as Anthony said. When I said, you know, the Philippine-American War. Oh, they thought I meant the Philippine-Americans against the Japanese. But I sorted it out. I mean, it's terrible. I couldn't find the grave because the records have been lost. There was a flood and so on. There are hundreds of thousands of people. So I don't know. I gave up looking for the grave. But the fact that those guys in that cemetery didn't know about the Philippine-American War is you know, very revealing. And also, I'll tell you this, I had a map which showed them the battle line near Caloocan, at the sort of at the border of the North Cemetery and the Chinese Cemetery. And that's the area where there was about the second or third day, there was a huge battle there. And there's a great old church, which is locked up, you can't get in, but that was used to site for the artillery. But there's no mention anywhere around that the war had happened and it was a big battle here. It's a shame. And if I may say so, I was fortunate enough, privileged enough to be at the unveiling of what I was told at the time was the only monument to Macario Sakai, the great leader, one of the great generals who continued the war as a bandito, a brigand. But I think there should be, as Ambeth Ocampo said, Fagan should always be remembered. David Fagan really deserves a monument. And I would say, of course, so does John Calloway.
John Calloway's granddaughter, Becca Mosley, and I did search for his grave at the Presidio, and I do not remember if we found it or not. I can't remember. It was so many years ago.
Now, he was definitely buried in the North Cemetery, Manila.
In Manila, okay.
Yeah, near Calooc. And
Well, we didn't know that either. Well, thanks for letting us know, Gill. I have a couple of questions. If you guys don't mind staying on a little longer, we can go through a couple of the questions. Maybe Frank and Anthony, you could answer this. Did the Jim Crow system apply in the Philippines when the Philippines was under the American regime?
Not as a legal system, no. But as far as how businesses operated, I just suspect that yes, that there wasn't a whole lot of mixing in bars in Manila, for example, but I don't know.
But I don't know if there was any signage, maybe. I don't think so. Maybe it was.
It wasn't something that you would put a big sign up because, the people of the island were people of color. Within the American bases, that was just a common thing. And you would think outside of that, in a saloon or bar that catered to white American soldiers, very unlikely that a black soldier get a chance to go in.
I think that's probably.
That makes sense?
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Hang on, let me just go through a couple of the other questions. Well,
Someone asked, I saw on the chat that somebody asked me something about my grandfather in Tennessee, Chattanooga, and I couldn't get the end of the sentence.
I'm just asking where your grandfather was from in Tennessee originally.
Oh, Chattanooga.
Okay. So, and apart from Calloway and the stories of Fagan and then Stokes, were there any other Buffalo soldiers that settled in the Philippines? Or they eventually moved back to the US?
There were. Okay.
Arabelle Thompson in the magazine Ebony wrote a really good article about black soldiers who stayed in the Philippines. This article was probably published in the late 30s, and that's about as close as I can get to a citation. Her name was Erabell Thompson. There may be more about that written, but there were definitely veterans of the Philippine-American War who stayed. Definitely, no question. I don't know how many.
And, as a matter of fact, when the Japanese took over, the civilian prison was San Tomas, and there were several African-American former soldiers that were in that camp. There was one guy who, after the war, he moved back to the States. His wife had died. I'm thinking he was in New England. I'm just having a senior moment on his name. But I have his bibliography that he wrote about his time in the military. And it was absolutely fascinating.
The estimates are various. Some people have said 500, others have said 1,000, but nobody really knows.
Bambina, I just wanted to mention that in terms of the music, I do both Filipino as well as blues. I'm a folk singer guitarist.
Oh,
And
cool.
so I learned from my mother some songs in Tagalog, and my father, who was Ilocano, he would sing songs like Pamolina Wen and my mother Magtanim. And then I do both of them, as well as spirituals and blues, as well as American ballads.
Will you perform professionally?
Yes,
Oh, lovely. Up to today.
up to today.
Oh, that's
I
amazing.
do a program here where I live, where I lead a folk music concert every other week. And there are 4 of us that lead it: guitars and cajon drum, other musical instruments.
I wanted to ask Anthony, we mentioned that we talked about it a little earlier, but you had presented something, or you did a book about a collection of photographs of the Buffalo Soldiers in the Philippine-American War, right? And you and both Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was also a collector. Can you just
That's correct.
that's also
Yeah.
that Kareem, Abdul-Jabbar had this great interest in the Buffalo Soldiers who had fought in the Philippines.
Yeah, he is just a very, very interesting man. You would think being a superstar and all of that, but he was grounded, he's down to earth, and he's very shy, okay? But yeah, we did an exhibition at the Schubert. I think it was, Christine, what year was that? Maybe it was 2002. And we did part of the exhibit was on African-American soldiers that served in the Philippines, between 99 and 1902. But, the Philippines was a pretty active post for Black soldiers. Sometimes we think of them only in the cavalry infantry, but there were a lot of post-ordnance sergeants, commissary sergeants, and all of that did stints at Stotzenburg and some of these other forts in the Philippines. And some of them came back. Leslie Marchbanks, Vance Hunter Marchbanks, and I'm about to publish his memoirs, did an excellent piece on living in the Philippines, as a warrant officer in the early 1920s.
Okay. I have a question. I don't know if there were no women in the war at that time, right? So it would be unlikely that any Black women would be part of the Buffalo Soldiers regiment.
Well, that's an issue of disagreement among historians. I mean, there's always Kathy Williams, or William Kathy. The documents that I have seen, there is no indication that she was female. Even when she was invalided out of the Army, once her unit got to the Texas area, she was invalided as a man. Okay. Now, that's not to suggest that, maybe the doctors of the regiment were kind of high on whiskey. You never know. But here in this country, we have all these people that say Kathy Williams, and, I try not to argue with them, but the facts that are presented by the documents that we have, unfortunately, say no.
Anthony, did you mention Walter Howard Loving?
Walter Loving. He was a very interesting gentleman. Walter Loving was the founder of the Philippine Constabulary Band in 1902.
Right.
And Walter served several tours of duty in the Philippines. He retired 2 times and then went back to the Philippines. His last time back to the Philippines was when MacArthur went to the Philippines, if I'm not mistaken, was the mid 30s. And he was brought back, they said that the constabulary band needed the loving touch. He was able to bring the band to San Francisco for the 1939 World's Fair. And he and his wife were captured during the fall of the Philippines during World War II. Uniquely, instead of being sent to San Tomas like other prisoners were, he was allowed, he and his wife, to live under house arrest. And it was like that until we reinvaded the Philippines, when the Japanese went kind of berserk and burned most of the city down, that he was captured and beheaded during that time. I think there are a couple of music schools that are named after Walter Loving. He was just a very genius, when it came to music. He originally served in the 24th Infantry. He served in the 48th Infantry as band leader, as a first lieutenant. And I think it was Howard Taft, who was the Governor General, offered him a position to form a band, and that was in 1902, and he became a sub-inspector of the Philippine Constabulary. But when he was beheaded by the Japanese, he was a full colonel.
Okay. There's an interesting, oh, sorry, Frank. No, I just wanted to point out all these interesting tidbits keep coming up. I think, Gill, you just saw this and you'd be interested because you spoke about Macario Sakay. It used to be what was known as Camp Eldridge before is now called Camp Macario Sakay. So thank you, Gemma Cruz Araneta, for that tidbit. I think, maybe I'll ask Mark to close today's session, unless any of you have something to say, like a final statement.
This was a fascinating program. And thank you so much for organizing it. And I thought all of the speakers were really fabulous, just fabulous. I learned a lot tonight too. Thank you.
No, thank you for joining us. It's been an absolute honor, Mark, and we owe it all to you for bringing us all together, because you approached me 5 years ago telling me about your film. And when I was thinking about In the Light of Black Lives Matter, I remembered your film and called you, and here we are today. So maybe Mark, you can close today's session.
It worked out great. I've surrounded myself with some very interesting and knowledgeable people and historians, and it's been a pleasure to know them and to speak to them about Philippine and American history, Buffalo history specifically. It's one of the joys of making documentary films, where you go and do research and investigate, and in the process, you meet people you would have never met. I mean, I think I read about Gill, but I said, oh, I'm gonna never meet Gill Boehringer. He's in Australia. How the hell am I gonna get to Australia? And then Gill shows up in New York. When was it, Gill? A couple of years ago?
Quite a few years ago, actually.
Time flies when you're having fun. Anyway, so we were able to sit down and do an interview, and it was fantastic. I and my producers look forward to completing this film. As I said at the head of the presentation, we're still in the research and development stage, and we're in the fundraising stage. So if any of the viewers have been inspired and find this story a story worth telling, please get in touch with Bambina Olivares, and she can put you in touch with me.
Oh, with pleasure. Pleasure.
Huh? And it's just this whole evening has been a wonderful exchange of information and knowledge and perceptions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Again, each and every one of you. It's been wonderful having you here, wonderful hearing all the stories. And also, Mark, it was brilliant to bring in the human aspect of it. I mean, there was history, but there was a human connection as well. So I thought that just rounded out the whole thing and made it even more real. We've recorded this event, and it'll be up on YouTube in a day or so. And yeah, someone just said it was well worth missing Michelle Obama. I love learning.
I saw that.
Thank you. That's like a
Those
huge
things are.
So you can do a rerun.
When we go to YouTube, what's the
Great
title?
Thank you. Thank you. And
Bambina, what's the
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bambina.
Evangeline. Thank you,
Thank you very
Gil.
much.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank
Thank
you,
you all.
Thank you, Frank.
Greg. Thank you,
All right, guys.
Frank.
hope you can make it back here someday. Hopefully.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
But I
yeah.
hear the U.S. needs some election watchers now.
What?
The U.S. might be needing some election observers now.
Oh,
So
Oh,
that's
yeah, right.
go
Don't
there.
even mention
That's
it.
right.
We need some mailboxes. Send them over.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Well,
Thanks. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Okay, thank you. See you
Yeah.
all.
Good to see you, Rick.
Yeah,
Good
have
to
a
see you, Rick.
Nancy.
Yep.
Bye. Thank you to Vince who had to leave early. Thank you, everyone, on behalf of Manila House. Thank you so much for joining us today.